I was 29 when this happened. That was 4 years ago now. I hadn't thought much about it until recently, when a memory from that trip just dropped into my mind again like a heavy rock falling in still water. I was out hiking a few weeks ago and stepped into a small clearing, and for a moment, I froze in place because it looked just like that spot near Cimarron where everything went wrong. Back in 2021, I had just gotten laid off from my job. I was working for a logistics company near Albuquerque, and I was burnt out. The job didn't pay well, the hours were terrible, and the environment was depressing. So when they let me go, it weirdly felt like a relief. I had some money saved, and I decided to take a few weeks to just disappear into the woods and camp out under the stars. I called my younger brother, Sean, who lived in Taos at the time. He was only a year younger than me, and we'd always been close growing up. I asked him if he wanted to go camping with me up in the Carson National Forest near Valle Vidal. I'd gone hunting up there a few times in the past with my dad, and I remembered it being really quiet, real isolated. Sean said he was down, and I told him I'd pick him up on a Friday and we'd stay out there till Monday or Tuesday. Just a few nights to clear our heads. We packed up my SUV with gear, 2 tents, sleeping bags, propane stove, canned food, some firewood, water, and a cooler. We brought a couple of pistols too. I always carried mine when I camped, just in case of mountain lions or something worse. I'd seen bear tracks out there before. We left early on a Friday morning and drove north out of Albuquerque, then cut northeast past Eagle Nest and toward Cimarron. The roads got smaller and rougher, and once we were into Carson, I found an old trailhead I remembered that wasn't on any public map anymore. The place was completely dead quiet. No cell service, no power lines, no nearby roads. Just endless trees and mountains. We parked the SUV near a faded signpost and hiked in about 3 miles to a spot I'd always liked. It was near a bend in a shallow creek, with a soft mossy clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines. We set up the tents a little ways apart, but still close enough that we could see each other. Then we gathered wood, boiled some creek water, and made a small fire as the sun dipped low behind the trees. That first night was calm. The stars came out strong. The air was cold and clean. We talked for a while, cooked some beans, drank a couple beers, and just sat around the fire till the logs burned low. I remember thinking how good it felt to be out there, just away from everything. The stress from the last job, the noise of the city, all of it just gone. Just wind and trees and sky. I went to bed around 11. I remember crawling into my sleeping bag, zipping up the tent flap, and feeling that quiet settle over everything. There were no coyotes howling, no rustling from deer or elk, just total stillness. It wasn't scary at first. It was peaceful. Then at some point during the night, I woke up. I didn't sit up or anything. I just opened my eyes inside the tent and stared up at the nylon ceiling. I thought at first that it was the wind that had woken me, but there was no sound. It was dead silent. I turned on my side and checked the watch strapped to the tent pole. It was just after 3:30 a.m. Then I heard it. It sounded like footsteps, but not heavy boots crunching through dry leaves or anything like that. These were soft, almost careful. They moved slowly around the tent, like someone circling it. I held my breath and strained my ears. The steps would come, then stop for several seconds, then start again. Always around the edge of the tent. I reached for the pistol I kept tucked in a side pouch and slowly wrapped my fingers around the grip. I didn't unzip the tent or call out. I just lay there, frozen, breathing shallow, listening. After maybe a full minute of that slow circling, the steps stopped completely. Then I heard something worse. It sounded like someone kneeling right next to the tent wall. The canvas shifted slightly, just barely. And then I heard a breath, a real human breath, not an animal, not the wind, just one slow, drawn-out exhale inches from the fabric. And then I heard my brother's voice say my name. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't loud. It was a low, soft whisper. Zach. I held still. My heart was hammering so loud I thought it might burst. But something felt off. The voice was Sean's, sure, but it was too quiet. And something in the tone sounded not right, like it had been flattened or dulled, like someone imitating his voice without emotion. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just waited. 30 seconds passed. Then a full minute. Then 2. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I stayed frozen till the sun started to rise and I could hear birds again. When light began to fill the tent, I finally unzipped it and looked around. No one was there. I walked over to Sean's tent. His flap was closed. I called his name once, no answer. I opened it and looked inside. He was still sleeping, curled in his bag, breathing slow and even. I watched him for a while. He didn't stir. Later that morning, when we both got up, I didn't tell him what I'd heard. I convinced myself it had just been a dream or that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, fatigue, whatever. It didn't seem real in the daylight. We spent most of the day hiking around the area, following a few deer trails, looking for signs of elk. We didn't see much, just a few birds and some old scat. But that feeling from the night before stayed with me, like something wasn't quite right. That second night, things got worse. We turned in a little earlier, maybe around 10. Sean had eaten a little too much and passed out almost immediately. I stayed up a bit longer, poking at the fire, watching the shadows move behind the flames. When I finally went to my tent, I lay there for a long time just listening. At around 1 a.m., I heard it again. This time, the footsteps didn't circle. They came straight up to the front of my tent and stopped. I could hear the breathing again, slower now, more confident. Then the voice came again, a little louder this time. "Zach, come here." That wasn't Sean. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The voice sounded more natural this time, closer to human, but there was no tone, no life in it, like someone saying the words without understanding what they meant. Then I heard something behind the tent, like more footsteps, lighter and faster, moving away into the woods. I gripped the pistol and slid the safety off. I didn't leave the tent. I waited there again until dawn. The next morning, I checked around the site. I didn't see any prints at first, nothing clear in the pine needles or soil. But about 30 feet beyond the tents, down the hill near the creek, I found a small area where the dirt looked disturbed, like someone had stood there for a while and turned in place. There were shoe prints, but they weren't mine, and they weren't Sean's. Too wide, and the treads looked shallow, almost smooth. That morning, I finally told Sean what I'd heard. He looked at me like I was overreacting. He said maybe I just had a nightmare, or maybe a raccoon or something had wandered near the tent. But his eyes didn't look sure. He didn't laugh or call me crazy. He just nodded and kept glancing toward the trees. That night, we both slept with our pistols nearby, but only one of us stayed in our tent. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of my tent unzipping. Only it wasn't mine. It was Sean's. I sat up and pulled my coat on. I quietly slid my pistol out of the holster and crawled toward the flap. I peeked through the small gap. Sean was gone. His tent was wide open, sleeping bag half pulled out, flashlight still on the floor. I stepped outside and scanned the woods. At the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 feet away, I saw something. It looked like Sean. Same jacket, same shape, standing perfectly still near a tree. I almost called out to him. I almost ran toward him, but something in my gut screamed not to. He was too still, arms at his sides, not moving at all. Even in the moonlight, I could tell something was wrong. I raised the pistol and called out just once, loud enough to carry through the trees. He didn't move. Then, after maybe 10 full seconds, he slowly turned and walked back into the woods without a sound. That's when I ran to his tent again. I searched it from top to bottom. Then I looked behind my own tent. Sean was sitting there, back against the trunk, fast asleep, wrapped in his sleeping bag, like he'd just decided to sleep under the stars. I shook him awake and asked why he was out there. He was confused, groggy. He said he got too hot in the tent and dragged the bag out sometime around midnight. He didn't remember anything else. I didn't tell him what I saw. We packed up camp before the sun came up. I never went back to Carson after that. Not once. I still hike. I still camp sometimes, usually closer to home, usually with more people. But I never sleep that deep anymore. I always keep the fire going all night. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who or what was out there. But I know that something wanted me to follow it. Something that looked like my brother. Something that used his voice. Something that waits. And I know this. If I had walked out into the trees that night, I don't think I would have come back. It was the summer of 2018. I was 26, living just outside of Exeter, working nights as a delivery driver for a small courier company. Most of my days were spent sleeping. My nights were filled with long, quiet drives through the countryside. I liked it that way. I liked the peace, the silence, and the feeling of being removed from everything and everyone. That year, I had developed a strange interest in old graveyards. I'm not even sure why. Maybe it was the night driving, or maybe I just liked how quiet they were, the way they stood there untouched for decades. I'd started visiting a few after my shifts, just to walk around, see the old stones, look at names and dates, wonder what kind of lives those people had led. Some were so old that the names had been washed away completely. Others had little personal messages that made you stop and think for a minute. It became a sort of ritual. I'd finish a shift around 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning, drive out to some rural graveyard, park somewhere off the road, and walk around for a bit. Sometimes I'd take a flask of coffee and just sit there, listening to the birds start up as the sky turned pale blue. There was one graveyard I kept coming back to. It was in a tiny hamlet called Longcombe, southwest of Newton Abbot. The graveyard was behind an old, half-abandoned stone chapel that no one used anymore. The front gate was always open. The gravel path was barely visible now, taken over by moss and weeds. The place had no lights, no cameras, and no traffic. Just a lopsided fence, the old stones, and a thick tree line behind it. Felt like the middle of nowhere, and I liked that. One night, while talking with a couple of friends in the pub, people who didn't get why I was into these places, I said something I shouldn't have. I told them I'd camp out overnight in one of the graveyards just to prove how little I cared. They laughed it off, thinking I was messing around. But I meant it. Not to prove anything to them, really. More to prove it to myself. That I wasn't spooked. That I could handle it. So I picked a date, July 17th. That was a Tuesday. I had a day off the next day and the weather was supposed to be dry. I chose the Longcombe graveyard because I knew it best. It was secluded, quiet, and I'd never seen another soul there. Felt safe in a strange, lonely kind of way. I packed light. Small tent, sleeping bag, headlamp, power bank, flask of coffee, a couple of sandwiches, a knife I usually kept in the van, and a cheap folding chair. I drove out around 8:30 p.m., got there just after dark. There was no moon, just cloud cover. The kind that glows dull orange near towns but turns pitch black as you get deeper into the countryside. I parked further up the lane so the car wouldn't be seen from the chapel. Not that anyone would be driving past at that hour. I walked the gear down the narrow path, past the sagging stone wall and the rusted iron gate. The grass was wet and tall, brushing against my boots. My headlamp beam bounced between the stones, some cracked, some tilted, some buried almost completely. I picked a flat spot near the back corner, away from the trees but not too close to the chapel. I could just make out the rows of headstones around me. None newer than 1975. Most were older. Some went back to the late 1800s. I set up the tent, laid out my bag, and sat in the chair with my coffee. There was a breeze coming off the hills, soft at first but steady. I listened to the wind move through the trees and the faint sound of animals in the grass. Mice, maybe a fox. You get used to those sounds when you work at night. They stop sounding strange after a while. Around 11 p.m., I killed the headlamp and just sat there in the dark. No phone.
No distractions.
Just the occasional gust of wind and the feeling of space pressing down on you. That's when I heard something different. Not a branch moving. Not an animal in the grass. This was slower, heavier, a deliberate sound. At first I thought it might be a deer stepping through the underbrush near the trees. But deer move quickly. This was paced, like someone walking and trying not to make too much noise. I stood up, keeping my hand near the knife in my side pocket. I didn't take it out. I didn't want to make a big deal out of something that was probably nothing. But I turned slowly, eyes fixed on the dark line of trees beyond the last row of graves. Nothing. I waited, listened. A few more seconds passed. Then I heard it again. This time it was closer. Not by much, maybe 5 or 6 steps closer. But I could tell it wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. The pace, the way the sound stopped when I moved. It was someone. I turned on the headlamp, sweeping it across the graves and up to the trees. Nothing again. Just leaves and branches. But that sound, it stopped the moment I turned the light on. I stood there for a full minute scanning. Then I walked to the edge of the graveyard where the grass met the trees. The undergrowth was thick, but not impossible to move through. I scanned the ground for footprints or broken branches, but didn't see anything. The ground was too overgrown. I listened again. Silence. I figured it might have been an animal after all, or maybe just my mind getting worked up over nothing. I walked back to the tent and sat down, but I didn't relax. I left the headlamp on, pointing at the trees. At around 1:15 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from behind the chapel. It sounded like something brushing along the wall, soft at first, then followed by a faint scraping noise, like a shoe dragging against stone. I stood up again. My heart was thudding now. I didn't want to go around the chapel. That side faced the road, and there was less cover. But I also didn't want to just sit there. I crept along the edge of the graves, careful not to shine my light directly at the chapel windows. When I got close, I crouched behind a low stone and waited. The sound came again, this time from even closer, like someone dragging something along the stone steps near the chapel's front door. I stepped out, fast, shining the headlamp directly at the spot. There was no one there. The front of the chapel was empty. The path was clear.
No marks, no footprints.
But I knew what I heard. I backed away slowly, scanning every inch of the area. I made my way back to the tent, zipped it shut, and sat inside with the lights still on. I didn't even take my boots off. For the next hour or so, I stayed frozen in place, every sense alert. I didn't hear anything else for a while, just the wind and the grass. I tried to tell myself it was my own fault. Choosing a place like this, telling people I'd do it, pushing myself into something weird just to prove nothing scared me. It was just past 2:30 when I saw the shape. From inside the tent, through the mesh flap, I could just make out a shadow moving between 2 rows of stones. It was low to the ground, then stood upright, slowly, like someone crouched and then rose. I held my breath. The figure didn't move like someone out for a walk or exploring. Paused too much, stayed too low. It was watching. I turned off the headlamp and waited in darkness, eyes fixed on the spot. When I looked again, it was gone. That was enough. I unzipped the tent slowly, grabbed my bag, and stepped outside. I left the tent behind. I wasn't going to waste time packing it up. I stayed low and moved toward the fence line, keeping behind the taller gravestones. I made it to the gate, but I didn't step through it, because right there on the path was a fresh footprint, deep, clear, and bigger than my own. And beside it, barely visible, was something that looked like a drag mark, like someone had pulled something heavy across the path. I stared at it for a second, then stepped back inside the graveyard. I moved to the far end, away from the gate and the road, and crouched behind one of the taller monuments. I stayed there, motionless, for almost 20 minutes. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything. The shape never returned. When I finally made a run for it, I didn't stop until I was back at the car. I didn't look behind me, I just drove. I never went back to Longcombe. Later that week, I read an old blog post by a local historian who had written about the chapel. Apparently, back in the late 80s, it had been used for some unofficial rituals, nothing occult or strange, just rural folk stuff. People leaving personal items behind. Worn-out shoes, broken tools. And for a while, there was talk that someone had been living rough in the woods nearby. Maybe even inside the chapel itself, though it had no working door or lock. The council sealed the building in 1994, but I knew what I saw and what I heard was real. It wasn't old stories or my imagination. Someone was in that graveyard that night, watching, moving, waiting for something. I still visit graveyards sometimes, but never at night, and never alone, and I haven't slept outdoors since. It was September of 2014 when I took a trip that I'd been putting off for a long time. I was 31 at the time, working in construction management for a small firm just outside of Bristol. The job was demanding, noisy, and filled with people. By the end of summer, I needed a break from everyone. I'd gone through a rough few months. My girlfriend of 4 years and I had split up in July, and I was barely sleeping, barely eating properly. I needed to get away, just to stop hearing other people's voices and stop seeing the same gray roads and traffic lights. I'd always liked camping, even if I hadn't done it much since my early 20s. So I booked a few days off work and packed up my gear for a solo trip. I didn't want to go to any of the well-known national parks or popular trails. The idea was to be alone, not surrounded by families with dogs or teenagers playing music out of portable speakers. I spent a few evenings looking through forums and maps and finally settled on an area near the edge of the North York Moors, about an hour's drive north of Helmsley. It wasn't exactly a designated campsite, more of a disused wooded area near an abandoned estate. People mentioned wild camping was possible there as long as you were respectful and didn't draw attention. That was all I needed. I left early on a Wednesday morning, about 5:30 a.m. The drive was long and quiet, just the way I liked it. Roads were empty that early, and the countryside felt untouched. I brought everything I needed: tent, stove, a few freeze-dried meals, a solar battery for my phone, and a physical map just in case. I wasn't planning on moving around much. Just one location, 3 nights, and then back home. By midday, I parked the car on a small gravel lay-by off a single-lane road, miles away from any proper town. I took my bag, locked the car, and walked into the trees. The forest was dense but not wild. You could tell people used to care for it long ago. Old stone walls half buried in moss, rusted fencing tangled in roots, and odd bits of glass or metal here and there on the forest floor. The estate that used to sit near there had burned down decades ago, and now the land was just slowly swallowing up the remains. I didn't mind that, felt untouched, lost in time. I hiked in about 40 minutes until I found a small clearing, mostly flat with a thick layer of soft moss and leaves. It was far enough from the road that I couldn't hear anything but wind and birds. No cell signal either, which I was actually looking forward to. I set up camp by mid-afternoon, pitched my tent under a wide ash tree, unpacked, and boiled water for a cup of tea. The first night was uneventful, peaceful even. I made dinner, read a bit with my headlamp, and crawled into my sleeping bag early. I fell asleep to the rustle of trees, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the odd scamper of a fox or rabbit outside the tent. It was perfect. The next morning, I woke up with sunlight cutting through the thin fabric of the tent. The air was cool and damp, and I felt better than I had in weeks. I spent most of the day exploring the surrounding woods. There was no real path, but I followed old, overgrown trails and stepped over fallen branches and ferns. At one point, I found what looked like the remnants of a small outbuilding or shed. Only the stone foundation remained, maybe a meter tall at the highest point. Moss covered most of it, but inside the square layout, you could still see the blackened bits of wood from what must have been a fire long ago. That night was when things started to feel off. I went to bed the same way I had the night before, fed, tired, and comfortable. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. No noise woke me, no dream either, just an instinct. I laid there for a while, listening. At first, I thought maybe a deer had come near the tent, or maybe a badger was sniffing around. But there was nothing, just stillness. No wind, no distant animals. That's what felt wrong. It was like the whole forest had stopped moving. That dead quiet where even your own breathing sounds loud. I stayed still for a long time, straining to hear something, anything. Eventually, I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I wasn't used to real silence anymore, not after years of city life. I managed to fall back asleep, but it wasn't deep. I kept waking up every hour or so, convinced something was different, but never finding anything. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and did my usual routine. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I did notice a patch of flattened grass about 20 feet from the tree line. At first, I assumed it was where I'd sat the day before, but the shape was wrong. Narrow and long, like someone had laid down there. I went over to it, crouched, and touched the grass. Still damp. No shoe prints or anything obvious, just the odd, pressed-down shape. I tried to shake it off. Animals make strange shapes when they bed down. Maybe a deer had rested there, or some other animal I hadn't seen. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I moved through the trees that day, I had the sense that something was just out of sight. I started noticing small things too. Twigs snapped at odd angles, disturbed leaves, something rustling behind me and going silent the moment I turned. I started checking over my shoulder more than I liked. I told myself I was imagining it, but I also stopped exploring that far from my tent after that. I kept close to camp and made a fire earlier than usual that evening, even though I'd planned on avoiding fires completely. The thought of flames and smoke comforted me a little. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid there in my sleeping bag, wide awake, ears straining again. And this time, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just the crunch of leaves, slowly, carefully. Then silence. Then another step. It wasn't a four-legged animal. These were human steps. The pauses were long and calculated, like someone trying to stay quiet but failing just enough. I didn't move. I didn't dare. I just listened as the steps circled the tent, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something, someone. Standing on the other side of the tent wall, there was a long silence. Then I heard the faintest sound of breathing, just for a moment, and then it was gone. No footsteps walking away, just silence again. I stayed frozen for what must have been an hour. Eventually, the first light of morning started to come through the fabric of the tent, and I forced myself to unzip the door and look outside. Nothing, just empty woods. No footprints, no broken twigs. Nothing to prove what I'd heard. I didn't pack up right away. I was still trying to tell myself that I'd imagined it, that maybe I'd fallen half asleep and dreamt it. But I knew I hadn't. I was too awake. My heart was still pounding. I made tea with shaking hands and sat on a rock, facing the direction I thought the sound had come from. That's when I saw him, about 30 or 40 feet back into the trees, partially behind the trunk of a thick beech tree. A man, just standing there, half covered by the tree, facing me. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the shadows, but he was tall, wearing a dark jacket and absolutely still. I stared at him. He didn't move. I thought maybe he was a hiker or a ranger, though there was no reason for either of those to be in these woods. But he just stood there, staring. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe a minute, maybe 5. But then I blinked, and when I looked back, he was gone. I stood up, back toward the tent, and started tearing everything down. I didn't care about folding anything properly. I stuffed it all into my pack, forced the poles into their bag, and hiked straight back toward the car, taking a different route just to make sure I wasn't being followed. I reached the road by midday and got in the car, locking the doors as soon as I sat down. I started the engine and didn't stop until I hit the outskirts of Helmsley. I parked in a supermarket lot and just sat there for a long time. I didn't even feel scared at that point, just numb, like I'd barely avoided something I didn't even understand. Back home, I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? That I saw a man standing in the woods, and he didn't move? That someone might have been watching me sleep? I sounded like a crazy person even to myself. A few days later, I looked up the area again, just to see if maybe others had stories about it. I didn't find anything official, but on an old forum post from years back, someone mentioned feeling followed in the same woods, near where the estate ruins were. Another post mentioned seeing someone watching them from a distance, but no one had any answers. No police reports, no missing persons, nothing. I still don't know who that man was, or why he was out there, silently walking around my tent in the middle of the night, or why he didn't say anything. He didn't try to rob me. He didn't threaten me. He just stood there, watched, waited. Maybe that's what unsettles me the most. If someone wants to hurt you, they usually do it. But someone who just watches, someone who moves in silence, who disappears the moment you look away, that's the kind of person who's done it before. I haven't been camping since. Not alone. Not even in proper sites. I think I lost the peace I used to find in quiet places. Silence doesn't comfort me anymore. It just reminds me of the sound of footsteps outside a thin layer of fabric, and the breath of someone you can't see, standing only a few feet away. And the worst part? I still wonder if he followed me back to the car. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to take a break from my job and go camping alone for a few days. I was 29 at the time, living in Derby, England. I had just quit a demanding position at a small design agency, and my head felt like it had been underwater for months. Too many screens, too many voices, too many pointless meetings. I didn't want a city holiday. I didn't want museums or beaches or anything polished. I just wanted a quiet place where my phone wouldn't work, where no one could find me, where I could just walk, cook my own food, sit near a fire, and fall asleep when it got dark. I'd always liked camping, though I hadn't done much solo. When I was younger, my uncle used to take me and my cousin up to places like Kielder Forest or the edge of the Peak District. We'd spend 2 or 3 nights out, eat tinned food, build little rock walls, and come home smelling like burnt wood and sweat. That was what I wanted to get back to. Something slow and simple, something far away. After looking around for somewhere not too popular, I found a woodland area in northern Wales, just outside a village called Cerrig-y-Drudion. The forest had no official campsite, but from what I read on old forums, some hikers had pitched up there without issue. There were no facilities, no parking spots, just miles of thick trees, overgrown paths, and some open patches if you knew where to look. I drove out early one Thursday morning. My car was a beat-up 2004 Honda Civic, which had never really let me down. I had a second-hand rucksack filled with gear I'd spent weeks researching and ordering. Lightweight tent, sleeping bag, fire starter, foldable pan, knife, oats, tinned food, water filter, first aid kit, the usual. I even bought a pair of trail shoes I couldn't really afford. By late afternoon, I parked the car on a grass verge beside a narrow road just north of the woods. There was no one around, just the whisper of wind through trees and the soft crackle of gravel under my boots as I double-checked I had everything. I hiked in for about an hour before I found a good spot, flat ground, plenty of tree cover, not too far from a small stream. It looked like others had used it in the past, judging by the old fire pit ringed with stones. I set up my tent and boiled some water. I had instant noodles and an oat bar, and I remember how quiet it was. That's the first thing that stood out.
No traffic, no planes, no chatter.
Just birds, wind, and the occasional creak of trees. After dinner, I read a bit and walked in circles around the site until the light started to fade. I didn't have a campfire the first night, just used my torch and climbed into my sleeping bag once it got cold. I slept okay, even though the noises kept pulling me out of it. Cracks in the underbrush, what sounded like small footsteps. I figured it was foxes or maybe deer. That was fine. What mattered was that I was away from everything, and no one knew where I was. The second day, I wandered further out. I left most of my gear behind and took a dry bag with food and water. The woods felt thicker the deeper I went. Some paths were barely visible, overgrown and crooked. I followed what looked like a deer trail for a while and ended up in a clearing with old wooden fence posts, half-rotted and leaning. There were rusted metal tools scattered around. Things like chains, broken spades, a wheelbarrow with its rubber melted into the ground. Looked like a small logging or farming site that had been left decades ago. I didn't think much of it then. I just sat on a tree stump, ate, and walked back slowly. That night was when things started to feel off. I made a small fire and sat near it as it got dark. I didn't see anyone all day, didn't hear voices or engines. But at some point, maybe an hour after sunset, I noticed movement past the firelight. Not close, just shapes flicking between trees. Quick, low, like something running. I stayed quiet and kept my hand near the handle of the knife I'd brought. Could have been anything, badgers, maybe, but they didn't move like badgers. They were taller and too quiet. I tried shining my torch toward the trees, but I couldn't see much. Just dense branches, a few leaves shaking in the wind. When I woke the next morning, there were footprints near the fire pit. Not clear ones, just disturbed patches of dry leaves and dirt in a kind of circular pattern. No boot tread, no toes or anything like that. Just clean patches in the exact shape and size of my own shoes. It was like someone had walked around the fire in the exact steps I took the night before. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't hear anything in the night. No twigs breaking, no voices, no gear shifting. And I always sleep light when I'm camping. For someone to walk that close without me hearing them, it didn't feel right. I thought about packing up and heading out, but I convinced myself it was probably just me being tired or paranoid. Maybe I walked around the fire before going to bed and forgot. Maybe wind or a fox moved the leaves in a weird way. I stayed. Day 3, I didn't go far. I collected more wood, filtered water, and mostly stayed near camp. But I kept getting this strange feeling in my chest, like something was just over my shoulder, watching me. Every time I turned around, there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and silence. Around mid-afternoon, I heard a sound like metal dragging through dirt. I stood still and listened. It came again, a short, scraping noise, like a shovel being pulled sideways. Then it stopped. I didn't move for at least 5 minutes. I didn't call out or go toward it. I just stood there, gripping my knife, waiting. Nothing else happened. Later, I checked around the area but didn't see anything unusual. No metal, no footprints, nothing moved. I started thinking maybe I was just on edge. My brain was making things up. The forest can play tricks like that. But that night, after I climbed into the tent, I heard it again. Not the dragging metal, this time it was breathing. I'm not exaggerating. I was lying there, half awake, when I heard slow, steady breathing just outside the tent wall. It wasn't loud. It was close and soft, like someone crouching low, exhaling through their nose. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my torch. I didn't even blink. The breathing went on for what felt like minutes. Then nothing. When I finally gathered the courage to unzip the tent and shine my light out, there was nothing. No person, no animal, no marks. Just trees and the glow of the fire's dying embers. The next morning, I found something that made me sick to my stomach. Behind my tent, near a tree, there was a pile of fresh dirt, about the size of a small hole. It was shaped like a shallow grave, maybe 2 feet wide, 4 feet long, and half a foot deep. The dirt was loose and damp, like it had been dug with a spade and then partly refilled. There were no stones, no tracks, no tools, just a fresh mound of soil exactly 15 feet from where I slept. That was it. I started packing immediately. I didn't bother with breakfast. I stuffed everything into my pack, stomped out the fire, and got moving. My legs were shaking. I didn't stop for water, didn't check the trail map. I just followed the same way I came, watching the ground, listening for any sound that wasn't my own footsteps. About 30 minutes into the hike out, I noticed another thing. My trail markers were gone. When I'd first set up camp, I marked trees with bits of orange cord, small, tied loops to help me retrace my steps. I'd only put them every few turns, but now they were all gone. Not one left. Branches were still broken where I'd stepped through, and my own boot prints were still faint in some parts of the dirt. But every bit of cord cut clean off. I was too far in to panic, but my chest was pounding. I knew which direction the road was, but not exactly how far. If I got turned around, I could end up deeper in the woods. I kept walking, faster than before, checking the sun every few minutes. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the road through the trees. When I stepped out, my knees almost gave out. My car was still there. No flat tires, no broken glass, nothing touched. I drove all the way home in silence. I didn't tell anyone what happened for months. I couldn't explain it properly. I kept thinking I'd sound paranoid, and maybe I was, but that grave-shaped hole, the breathing, the missing markers, that wasn't in my head. Someone was out there and they were watching me. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. Maybe they wanted to get closer but backed off. Maybe they were waiting to see how long I'd stay. But I left before they could find out. I haven't gone solo camping since. And every time I think about it, the soft breathing, the scraped dirt, the identical footsteps around the fire, I know I wasn't alone in those woods, not even for a minute. I was 34 that year, living alone in Glasgow, working night shifts at a packaging plant. I'd been trying to claw back some sanity after burning out from work. No wife, no kids, just silence and a growing dread every time I closed my eyes at home. My doctor told me to take a break, said I needed to reconnect with something real. I didn't want to do yoga or therapy. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just wanted some quiet, so I packed up my gear and drove north. Didn't tell anyone where. Somewhere between Pitlochry and Kinusey, I pulled over at a side road that dipped through a dense thicket of fir and pine. No signs, no cabins, no fences, just forest. I took that as a good sign. The gravel track twisted for miles through the woods until it opened near an old, rusted footbridge crossing a narrow river. The bridge didn't look like it had seen traffic in years.
No paint.
Just bare metal turned orange with age. A wooden sign leaned against a boulder nearby, the lettering long since worn off. Behind it, the tree line thickened like a wall. It was remote enough. I cut the engine and sat for a second, letting the quiet soak in. Just drizzle tapping on the roof. I pitched my tent a few dozen feet off the trail, under a patch of Scots pine. I laid out my sleeping bag, set up a small tarp to keep the gear dry, and got a fire going with damp wood. It was late September, and the days were already shrinking. It was cold, too. Wet kind of cold that bites under your clothes. By the time the fire got going properly, the drizzle had turned into a cold, steady rain. Not heavy, just constant. The kind of rain that doesn't soak you right away, but keeps creeping in no matter what you wear. I kept the fire small and sheltered it with a few split logs I leaned into a makeshift barrier. I sat there, sipping cheap whiskey from a flask and listening to the wind in the branches above.
No phones.
No people. I felt better already, until the bridge creaked. It was just once. A sharp, dry sound like metal shifting under weight. I froze, listened, but the rain muffled everything. I stood up, walked down to the edge of the trail. My boots squelched in the mud. The bridge was about 20 yards away. I stared at it for a long time. Nothing moved. Probably just wind, I thought. The metal might have shifted under the temperature change. I told myself that and went back to the fire. But I didn't drink anymore. Just sat, poking at the embers, scanning the trees behind me every few minutes. Later, close to midnight, I put out the fire and zipped myself into the tent. The rain had gotten heavier, pinging hard off the tarp and pooling at the edges of the canvas. Inside, it was warm enough. I took off my boots, left them outside under the flap, and lay back. I stared at the nylon ceiling. It bulged with drops sliding down in crooked trails. I was just dozing off when I heard it again. The bridge creaked. Not once this time, twice. Then I heard splashing. Slow, deliberate steps crossing the shallow water below the bridge. The water couldn't have been more than knee-deep, but the footsteps were steady, deliberate, not someone slipping or stumbling. It was like someone was wading slowly across the river instead of using the bridge. I lay completely still. I didn't breathe. The steps reached the other side. Silence. Then a dull scrape, metal on metal. The same creaking sound I'd heard before. Something was on the bridge now. I could hear it pressing down with slow weight. Then another step. Another. It stopped halfway across. I didn't move. For a long time, there was no sound but the rain and the wind. Then I heard something that sent ice into my chest. It wasn't a voice, wasn't breathing. It was a thump, a hard single thump, like something dropping onto the bridge. Then again, and again. It wasn't walking. It was hitting the metal with something, not stomping, just a heavy tap at intervals like marking time. I don't know how long it went on. Could have been 30 seconds. Could have been 10 minutes. I just stared at the ceiling and listened. Finally, the thumping stopped. I waited another hour before I moved. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't check my boots. I just stayed perfectly still, heart pounding, mouth dry. I eventually fell asleep around dawn. When I woke up, the rain had stopped. Pale morning light filtered through the canvas. I crawled out stiff and sore, my legs half numb. My boots were still under the flap, wet but there. I checked around the tent.
No footprints.
No signs of anything disturbed. Just water pooling in the soft soil and wet pine needles everywhere. I walked down to the bridge. The metal was slick with rain and rust. The wood planks between the beams looked old but solid. There was moss growing on the far side where the trees thickened. I didn't cross. I just stood there, staring across the river. I checked the banks. There were no clear prints, just swirls in the mud like maybe someone had slipped in and out. But that could have been anything. Animal, water flow, who knows? I told myself again it was probably nothing. But I packed up and left right after breakfast. I should have gone home, but I didn't. Instead, I drove another 50 miles east, deeper into Cairngorms National Park. I told myself I was being paranoid. I stopped near a trail called Glenderry, parked behind some trees off a fire road. The sky was dark again, and the air smelled like wet bark. I found another spot near a rocky stream, far from the trailhead. Still forest, still wet, but no bridges. That night, the rain came down harder than before. The wind picked up, howling through the narrow gaps between the trees. The tarp flapped all night. My tent groaned against the gusts. I didn't sleep. I lay there again, staring at the ceiling, hearing every twig snap outside. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. Not from the stream, not from the trail, from the forest behind my tent. Crunch. One footstep, then nothing, then another. Whatever it was circling. Slow, careful. Wet leaves underfoot. It didn't stumble. It didn't run. Just one step every few seconds. I gripped the knife I kept by my side. I didn't breathe. Then silence again. Total. I lay there for an hour. Nothing. Then the tent wall caved in slightly, just near the top. Something pressed against the fabric. Just for a moment. Then it was gone. At dawn, I stepped out.
No footprints. No markings.
No animals. Just broken twigs and a faint mark near the back of the tent. Like someone brushed a wet coat sleeve against it. I packed up again.
No coffee. No breakfast.
I drove without stopping. I made it to a petrol station around noon and sat in the car, soaked in sweat and mud, staring into nothing. I wasn't scared anymore. I was tired, bone-deep tired. Whatever was happening wasn't normal, but it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't magic. It was a person. Had to be. And they were following me. That night, I didn't go home. I parked in a public lot near a hostel in Avimore, surrounded by other hikers' cars. I sat in my seat, reclined it back, and locked all the doors. I figured if I wasn't alone in the woods, I'd be safe. But around 1 a.m., I woke up cold. The windshield was fogged. Rain was falling again. I rubbed the glass with my sleeve. Across the lot, under a flickering lamp, I saw a figure standing perfectly still.
No umbrella. No jacket.
Just standing. They turned slowly, not toward the light, not toward the hostel, but toward me. I blinked, looked again. Gone. That was it for me. I drove home the next morning. When I got back to my flat, I didn't unpack. I sat on the floor with the knife still in my pocket and the tent still muddy in the bag. I didn't sleep that night or the next. I never camped again. I bought locks, cameras, moved flats 6 months later, but I never figured out who it was. All I know is this: they weren't trying to hurt me. If they wanted to, they could have. They wanted me to know they were there. They wanted me to feel watched. And it worked, because even now, 6 years later, I still wake up when it rains, and I still hear that creaking bridge. I was 32 the year it happened, back in the fall of 2016. I had just started getting into solo camping. I wasn't trying to prove anything, really. I just wanted the quiet. At that point in my life, I had been through a rough few years. My dad passed away in 2013, and I had been living with him before that, taking care of him during the last stages of his cancer. After he was gone, the house felt too empty. I sold it a year later and moved into a small one-bedroom apartment outside of Billings, Montana. Not exactly the city life, but more noise than I liked. So, in the fall, when the air was getting crisp and most of the tourists had cleared out of the woods, I packed up my gear and headed out. I picked a state forest about 2 hours away, past the smaller towns, where the cell signal got spotty and the roads turned to gravel. I had been there before with my dad when I was younger, but I didn't remember much besides a few dusty trails and cold creeks. I wasn't looking for scenic views or curated campsites. I wanted quiet. I wanted to hear myself think. I drove a beat-up Ford Ranger I'd bought the year before. Nothing fancy, but it did the job. I had a canvas tent, a basic sleeping bag, some canned food, a camp stove, and a collapsible chair. I also brought a Ruger .22 pistol in the glove box. I wasn't worried about bears, they usually stayed away from people, but I'd rather have something and not need it than the other way around. The spot I chose was about 6 miles off the main forest road. I parked the truck near a small pull-off, then hiked about half a mile in with my gear. I picked a flat area near a line of old pines with enough space to set up the tent, but not so open that I'd be visible from the trail. There weren't any fire rings or benches, which was exactly what I wanted. Untouched, private. The first day was uneventful. I set up camp, boiled some water for coffee, then just sat for a while. It was quiet, almost too quiet. You forget how loud towns and cities are until you step out into places like that. No engines, no phones buzzing, no dogs barking. Just the wind in the branches and the occasional crack of something falling deep in the woods. That first night was calm. I ate some beans, drank some warm instant coffee, and lay down in the tent before it got too cold. The moon was barely a sliver, and the forest got dark fast. My lantern threw soft light on the canvas walls, and I listened to the wind. I fell asleep fast and didn't wake up once. It was the kind of sleep I hadn't had in years. The next day, I hiked a little further into the woods. No goal, really, just walking. I found a shallow creek, followed it for a while, and sat on a rock for an hour, just watching the water. I didn't see another person. No signs of campers, no rappers, no footprints. That was the kind of place I liked. I went back to camp around 3 p.m., ate a can of ravioli and read for a while. I brought an old paperback with me, nothing heavy, just something to pass the time. The sun dipped low and the shadows got longer. It was colder than the night before and the wind had picked up. I remember noticing something strange around 6 p.m. The wind died completely, like someone hit a switch. The trees stopped moving, and the woods felt off. Not silent, but still in a weird way, like the forest was waiting for something. I shook it off at first. Maybe I was just tired. I ate quickly and got into the tent early. I didn't feel right sitting out in the open. It wasn't fear, not exactly, just discomfort. The kind of feeling that creeps in without a reason. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I lay there listening. My ears were still ringing slightly from the silence. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not animal movement, actual steps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They were coming from the east side of the camp, the part facing the denser trees. At first I thought it was a deer, but it didn't sound like that. It didn't pause or scuffle or make the random sounds animals make. It was steady. I stayed still. My pistol was just inside the tent flap, next to my boots. I didn't reach for it right away. I just lay there trying to listen. The steps stopped. For a full minute, maybe longer, there was nothing. I sat up slowly and pulled on my jacket. Then I heard something new. Breathing. Not loud, but close. Just outside the tent wall. I grabbed the pistol and held it low, safety off. My heartbeat was in my ears. I thought about calling out, but something told me not to. I didn't want whoever or whatever it was to know I was awake. Then the breathing stopped. I waited. Still nothing. I stayed frozen for maybe 10 minutes, listening to the kind of silence that doesn't make sense. Then I finally unzipped the tent a few inches and peeked out. There was no one. The camp looked the same. My gear hadn't been touched. The fire pit was cold. I stepped out slowly, shining my flashlight in every direction. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of anyone. But I knew what I'd heard. I wasn't imagining it. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. Something was wrong in that forest. I didn't want to stick around and find out what. I packed everything up quickly, keeping the pistol tucked in my waistband. I scanned the woods constantly as I worked. Still no signs of life. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. When I finally reached the truck and loaded up, I felt a wave of relief, like I had crossed some invisible line. But when I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine didn't start. The lights flickered, then died. The battery was completely dead. I checked the cables. Nothing loose, no corrosion. The battery was less than a year old. I stood there for a while, trying to decide what to do. I had no cell signal, no way to call for help, and the nearest ranger station was at least 5 miles back down the road. I started walking. About 2 miles in, I saw something strange in the dirt. Tire tracks that hadn't been there before. They were fresh, wide like from a heavy truck. Not mine. I followed them for a while, thinking maybe someone had come through early and I'd run into them. But the tracks didn't lead anywhere. They turned off the road into the trees and vanished. That's when I noticed the smell, like something rotting. Not sharp, just faint, like old meat or wet fur. I followed the direction of the tracks for maybe 50 yards, then stopped cold. There was a tarp in the trees, blue, torn at one corner, weighed down with stones. My heart started racing. I moved closer, one step at a time. There were no sounds, no wind, nothing. The tarp was covering something. I didn't lift it, couldn't. I just stood there staring. There were flies. I turned and walked away, fast but careful. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention. My mouth was dry and my skin felt like it didn't fit right. Every step felt like someone was watching me. I walked all the way back to the road and kept going. By the time I reached the ranger station, my legs were burning and I could barely feel my fingers. The ranger on duty didn't say much after I told him what I found. He just nodded and made a few calls. I sat in the small lobby and drank a warm bottle of water while 2 other rangers went out with him. They found the tarp. They didn't say what was under it, but they made me file a statement and took down every detail I could remember, where I camped, what I heard when I left. They asked about my truck too. When they went back to it later that day, it started on the first try. I didn't go back for the rest of my gear. I told them they could keep it. That was almost 9 years ago. I haven't been camping since. I tried once, drove out to a different forest with a friend, different state, different setup, but the second night I couldn't sleep. Every crack of a branch, every breeze, made my stomach twist. Sometimes I think about the breathing outside my tent, the way it stopped so suddenly, the footsteps, the truck battery dying out of nowhere, the tarp. I still don't know what was under it. I never asked. I never went back. And the part that haunts me the most? There were no lights.
No flashligra, no lanter, no lamp.
Whoever was out there that night, they were walking in complete darkness, like they knew every tree and root and stone by memory, like they had done it before, too many times. It was the summer of 2013, and I had just turned 29 a few weeks earlier. I lived in a small rented flat on the edge of Nottingham, working part-time at a car dealership and spending most of my free time hiking, walking, or reading. My friends had moved on to other cities for work or family, and I had grown comfortable being alone. That June, I decided to take a solo camping trip out in the Lincolnshire countryside. I found a place online, not an official site, but someone's private farmland listed on a forum. It was described as quiet, far from main roads, with a small patch of woods, a river, and enough space to be left alone. The owner wasn't asking for money. He just said to clean up after yourself and don't damage anything. I found it weird at first, but I didn't think too hard about it. I emailed the guy, and he just replied with a pin on a map and said, "Pitch wherever you like." I packed my gear: a 2-man tent, a small camping stove, canned food, waterproof clothes, and my old military-style rucksack. I had an old Nokia phone, not a smartphone, with barely any signal once you left town, but I brought it anyway. I also packed a small hunting knife, which I always carried when camping, just for safety. I didn't expect to use it. I drove out early on a Tuesday morning, taking the A1 and then winding down narrower roads into Lincolnshire. The land flattened out after a while. Large green fields, open skies, and the occasional clump of trees or hedges. I followed the directions until I reached a small wooden gate, painted white but chipped and sun-bleached. There was a hand-painted sign nailed to the fence post that said, "Camping Field. Enter and close gate behind." I opened the gate, drove through slowly on the uneven dirt track, and shut it behind me. The track went on for maybe half a mile, winding between fields, until it reached a small clearing with a line of trees behind it. There was no house in sight, no vehicles, not even power lines. Just open land, the rustling sound of wind through grass, and the distant call of crows. I parked the car by a tree, unloaded my gear, and set up the tent in a spot that had good tree cover and wasn't too close to the edge of the woods. The air smelled fresh and earthy. It was warm, but not too hot. The sky was overcast, and the wind had that soft, shifting sound that tells you it might rain later but not yet. That first day was peaceful. I went on a long walk down a path that followed the edge of the woods, crossed a shallow stream, and looped around back through tall grass. I didn't see anyone. Not a farmer, not another camper, nothing. The only man-made thing I noticed was a single power pole far off near the horizon and a rusted tractor sitting dead in a field. That night, I cooked some baked beans and sausages over my little stove and ate while sitting on a fallen log. I heard owls and something walking in the leaves a bit too far to see. Probably a deer or fox. It didn't bother me. I liked the quiet. That's what I came out for: space, air, stillness. It started raining gently around midnight. I was already inside the tent and reading by torchlight. The sound of rain tapping the fabric was calming. I zipped up the tent, tightened the guy lines, and lay down to sleep with the patter of rain in my ears. I woke up sometime before dawn. The rain was harder, steady, and cold. I stayed in my sleeping bag, listening to it for a while until I heard something strange. A sound that didn't fit. It was a soft scraping noise. Not close, not loud, just faint and steady, like something dragging lightly over a tree or fence post. I thought it was just a branch moving in the wind. That was the logical answer, and I told myself not to overthink it. But when I stepped outside the tent around 8 a.m., I saw something odd. There were tracks in the mud. Not deep ones, but clear. Footprints. Not boots, not trainers, bare feet. Human feet from the heel to the toes, maybe a size 9 or 10. They came from the edge of the woods and circled my tent twice before heading back toward the trees. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't panic. I just stood still and felt the back of my neck go cold. I tried to explain it. Maybe someone else was camping nearby. Maybe a farmhand passed through in the night. But who walks barefoot through wet mud in the dark rain and doesn't say a word? I boiled water for tea and tried to shake it off. I walked to the tree line where the prints led, but after a few meters they faded. The grass was too thick. No broken branches, no sign of movement, just those prints in the mud around my tent. The day passed slowly. I stayed close to camp, didn't walk far. I kept feeling like someone was watching, even though I knew that was probably just me being on edge. Still, I checked my gear, made sure my knife was where I left it, and kept it on me. I barely ate. My stomach felt tight the whole day. Around 6 p.m., the rain stopped and the sky lightened a bit. I walked down toward the stream again, more out of restlessness than anything. The air smelled clean after the rain, and I wanted to convince myself everything was fine. That's when I saw the first shirt. It was caught in a thorn bush near the stream. A flannel shirt, dark red and black, ripped and stained with mud. It had buttons down the front, but some were missing. It looked like it had been out there for a long time, but not so long that it was falling apart. It still held its shape. I picked it up with a stick and checked for any markings, name tags, size label, anything, but the tag had been torn out. I left it there. I didn't want it. I didn't want to touch it more than I already had. I walked back to my tent and zipped everything shut tight. That night was worse. It rained again, not hard but steady. I kept the knife close and barely slept. I heard noises, faint crunches in the grass, water sloshing in the stream, movement in the woods. My heart stayed up in my throat the entire night, but I never saw anything, just shadows, just sounds. At dawn, I got up, packed quickly, and made the decision to leave. I wasn't going to stay a third night. It wasn't worth the peace or the air or the silence. Something didn't feel right. As I started packing the tent, I noticed something even worse than the footprints. There was a cut in the side of the tent. A clean, straight slit about 10 inches long, just behind where I had been sleeping. I didn't hear it happen, and it hadn't been there the day before. The canvas was sliced, not torn. It had been done with something sharp. I stopped moving. My mouth went dry. I turned in a full circle, scanning the trees, the grass, everything. Nothing moved. No sound but birds and wind. I didn't even bother packing everything properly. I just stuffed things into the bag, threw it in the back seat, and drove out of there as fast as the dirt path allowed. I didn't stop until I was well past the gate and back on the road. When I got home, I looked up the email thread with the man who had told me to camp there. I tried to email him again to ask who else might be on that land. The message bounced. The account was gone. I checked the forum where I found it. The post had been deleted. I dug a little deeper and found something strange. That piece of farmland had been part of an abandoned estate sold off years ago. The land wasn't registered to anyone now. No active farming license. No buildings. No residents. Just empty land and woods. That cut in the tent still bothers me. It was behind where my head would have been. If I hadn't woken up early. If I hadn't gotten up and out when I did. If the knife hadn't just been beside me. I still go camping, but I never do it alone anymore. And I never go somewhere that isn't official, mapped, and watched. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know they were watching me. And I know I should have left that morning, not the next.